It's good to be back at Oak Hammock. There's a lot of new faces here, so 2 seconds on the Clio Institute, which is my new employer. I've gone back to work part-time. Clio Institute is the premier Florida climate literacy and advocacy organization. We are Florida-centric, and it allows me even a wider breadth of resources for programming for Oak Hammock, even more than the University of Florida. So I'm pleased to be wearing my new corporate t-shirt. There are 2 things that I want you to know that are in the back of the room. One is there's a new petition for right to clean water, an amendment for the Florida Constitution. I know many of you signed it last year. We have a revised petition. It's clearer. And so please take a petition, sign it, and leave it there, and I'll make sure it gets to the right place. And the second is, if any of you are people who are of some faith tradition, whatever that may be, or are interested in faith as a spiritual look at the climate situation, there's a workshop Tuesday, April 16th. It's free. It's all afternoon. It's going to share some national clergy speakers and some local climate activists. And the end result of that will be having some idea of what you can do yourselves to amp up your own climate action. So there are flyers for that in the back as well. Thank you. It is my absolute delight to introduce you to a very versatile, very unique, very amazing professor from University of Florida, Dr. Andrew Zimmerman. He is an organic geochemist. He's a professor of geological sciences at UF. He teaches courses in climate change, oceanography, sustainability science, and geobiology. He studies carbon cycling, particularly that produced by fires. He wants to understand how past human activities have led to global change. His recent focus has been on how best to convert waste biomass, garbage if you will, to charcoal, biochar, and that can be used to sequester, suck carbon out of the air and hide it, to sequester carbon in soils, mitigating climate change while enhancing soil fertility. And so without any further ado, I introduce you to Dr. Andrew Zimmerman.
All right, thank you, everyone. Everyone can hear me well? Okay. So yes, the title of the talk, Biochar, will that go away? How charcoal can save the world. So that is kind of a question mark there, or kind of a joke, but hopefully glad you found it interesting enough to come today. So thanks for coming. So I'll just start off with an outline like I do in my lectures in classes at UF. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems that this is addressing, which is both soil degradation and climate change, and this solution, biochar, with some history on where this concept came from. What's the concept? I'll spend a little bit of time talking about my own research, but I'm not going to get into detailed scientific data analysis, things like that. And we'll end with the big picture, how it's looking for this biochar solution. So the first problem that the world has is soil degradation, or you could say feeding the world. You can see from these numbers that we used to have about 0.32 hectares of arable land per person, and now because of both population growth and soil degradation and land conversion, we have less land per person. And of the land that we have, half of it is severely degraded. We have all these different problems of losing organic matter and nutrients in soil, some cases salinization, or the soil is getting saltier so they can't grow crops, or contamination. And then climate change itself is causing some crops that can't be grown in certain places anymore, or just urbanization is also a trend, a population trend. And this map shows this widespread degraded soils, basically soils that have been farmed on for a long time, losing their nutrients, losing their organic matter. And another data slide for you. We still have growth in crop yields. This is, we've still got what's called the agricultural revolution going on, or increased use of technology for growing crops. So we still have growth, but the growth each year of crops produced is decreasing and soon, not going to match up with population growth. Another problem we have is just the fact that, we're having to put all this fertilizer on soils to keep up this crop production. And fertilizer itself is produced using fossil fuels, so causing climate change. And you may know that, nutrients can run off of our soils. The fertilizer runs off, causes eutrophication or growth of algae in our water bodies. And there's another problem, which is that, we're using, whereas nitrogen, we can make the nitrogen in the fertilizer using fossil fuels, but the phosphorus has to be mined. And there's only a few places in the world that you can mine phosphorus. Morocco and Florida are actually the two biggest places. But we think we're going to reach what's called peak phosphorus, meaning we'll basically run out of phosphorus to mine. And so then we'll have another agricultural problem. So it's predicted that, we're going to be by 2050, we'll have 9 billion people on the planet. And at the same time, urbanization causes people to change their diets to eating more meat, which requires more crops. And so it's estimated that we need to produce 60% more food to feed this population by mid-century. So, where will that increase come from? We don't really know. But we do know that, it has to be done in a sustainable way. That is a way that doesn't cause more climate change, more pollution, more of these problems. Okay, now the other problem, climate change, and I'm not sure if you've had any climate change talks in here in this series, many, but so I'll just give a little background. You probably know that temperature is rising, and over the last century, since the Industrial Revolution, we have an increase of 1.2 degrees Celsius or 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Last year, 2023, was officially the hottest year on record. We reached 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. But that, what happens in the future really depends on what we do starting now, whether we take what's called strong mitigation and start leveling off our greenhouse gas emissions right away. But we're still going to see temperatures, in say about 3 or 4 degrees above pre-industrial at high latitudes, which is where we have our ice, and that will cause melting and sea level rise. Or the really scary scenario, business as usual, is reaching temperatures of maybe 10 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. And it's, generally, the general consensus in the scientific community is we don't want to cross 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. That's the threshold at which we'll start to see big issues in terms of, agriculture and ecosystems and all of our infrastructure. Okay, so what do we need to do to avoid this problem? To keep warming below 2 degrees, emissions need to fall by 40% in just about 10 years and reach net zero, or basically zero emissions, by 2080. If we take no action, by the end of the century, we'll be way above that threshold at 4.5 degrees. This one, you probably have heard of the Paris Accords, where countries got together and they all published what are called NDCs, or every country promising, here's what we think we can do. Well, if every country did what they said they would do, we would still be at 3.5 degrees above zero. And so that looks nowhere near what we need to do to keep below that 2 degree threshold. But there's a problem. Of course, there's many problems, but one of them is that, this goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2080, there's some greenhouse gas emissions that is actually difficult to imagine with our current technology or even near future technology that we can eliminate. Some of these are in aviation because fossil fuels is a really dense energy source and we don't have something else that can replace that in planes, or for making cement, fertilizer, plastics. Some plastics are made from fossil fuels. And so, it could be up to maybe about a third of our carbon emissions that we don't really see how we can eliminate. And there's even some natural emissions, like from, methane that comes out of swamps naturally, or basically cow farts. I mean, unless we're going to go completely vegetarian, we're still going to have these emissions. So it's agreed that we need not just to bring our emissions down to almost zero, but because of these emissions we can't eliminate, we need what are called CDR, carbon dioxide removal. Somehow ways to suck it out of the atmosphere in order to be on the path that we need to keep our planet below that critical threshold. So there's a lot of different of these carbon removal mechanisms. Another acronym you hear is CCS, which is carbon capture and sequestration, or another one is NETs, or negative emission technologies. Some of these include, growing more forests. A problem with that is you can grow forest and capture carbon, but you can have a fire and then you've lost all that stored carbon, or you can have a insect infestation and all that forest dies. There's direct air capture techniques using chemicals and maybe pump that carbon underground. But this is right now at least a very expensive technology. Another one is ocean fertilization, which is adding basically iron to areas of the ocean that can grow more algae, and maybe those algae can sink to the bottom of the ocean. But that one is kind of messing with the ecosystem and not necessarily work. Just because you can grow more algae doesn't mean it will sink to the ocean floor. So what I'm going to be talking about is this one, using something called biochar to grab carbon out of the atmosphere and hold on to it. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about charcoal. So charcoal, is produced from fire, and we have our first fires on Earth. 420. As soon as we started having plants, we basically started having fire. We can find little bits of charcoal in 420 million year old layers of soils and sediments. So we know fire's been around a long time. And pretty recently, people have been, like me, have been trying to look at the chemical signature of carbon in soil. And it's now estimated that maybe a big part of the carbon in our soil, 5 to 40%, might be charcoal or fire derived. So that right there is an indication that this is very kind of stable stuff. Now, humans have been using charcoal in a lot of different ways for a long time. One way is, the first artwork that we find, cave art, and they use charcoal for that. People have been cooking using charcoal, because when you burn charcoal, you produce less smoke than if you burn wood. So for cooking indoors, it's been used for a long time. People have known about its filtration properties, like in gas masks, or purifying liquids for drinking, purifying water. And this picture actually comes from, I was visiting Korea, and a lot of houses in Korea have these little charcoal statues, sculptures inside their homes. And I asked, what is that for? And that's for filtering the air, smells out of their houses. And I don't know how well that works, but that's been around for thousands of years. So all these different applications of charcoal have been around. One of the biggest applications in terms of volume of charcoal needed is for smelting. metallurgical. And that is because to melt copper or to melt iron, you need a very high temperature. And charcoal burns at a much higher temperature than wood. And so whether it's these pictures of furnaces from Greece and Rome, or even up around in Pennsylvania, you can be walking through the woods and come upon these stone structures. Those were old furnaces used for smelting iron. And so there's a occupation called a collier, which has been around for hundreds, thousands of years, someone who makes charcoal. And there's a lot of different techniques for making charcoal. These are some, there's an artwork of the collier at work, or even in Africa today, people making charcoal. This is to sell to people to use in their homes for cooking. And another type of burning that we see historically is, you probably heard of slash and burn agriculture. That is, people grow their crops, and after they've harvested the crops, they burn the residues. And when it's just slash and burn, you're just left with ash. And that ash has minerals in it and adds to the fertility of the soil so you can keep, growing in the next year. But there's something else that we found called slash and char happening in some places of the world. And we think it was especially in the Amazon, because in the Amazon, in these small areas, we find these very dark soils. So in English, it's called dark earth, or in Portuguese, terra preta. So these terra preta soils that, so if you've ever been to the tropics, a rainforest, this is what the soils usually look like. These, iron, they are rich in iron and manganese, and very, very, very light, orangey colors, no organic matter. The carbon in a tropical forest is not really accumulating in the soil. It's cycling through the vegetation. But in these small areas of the Amazon, we find these very dark soils, which are very highly prized for agriculture. In some places, they even mine them and sell them. And with the investigation of these soils really only started in about 20 years ago, in the early 2000s. And that's when I started hearing about them. These small areas, you can see usually along riverways where people lived. And they often have a lot of ceramics mixed in with them. And when you date the soils, they're really only, a specific time period. This is the time period that we think we had very large populations of people living in the Amazon, pre-Columbian, when they were killed by, disease brought by Westerners. But so we're seeing that the carbon, with more investigation, the carbon in these soils is a lot of it from charcoal. And so we think they were practicing slash and char agriculture to enrich their soils. Now, we don't really know exactly how they did it. It might have been accidental. That is, maybe they were just, they had a waste dump outside of their town, of their villages, and they were bringing all their kitchen waste. So that would have contained charcoal and, organic waste. And maybe then they moved it out into their fields just to get rid of it. It could have been unintentional or intentional. Maybe they understood that this is how you enrich their soils. But this finding of terra preta is really what inspired the whole biochar movement. Okay, so before I start on biochar, there's a few different words that you see around. So plain old charcoal it could be really anything. It's not a very specific term. Like you can buy charcoal in the store for putting in your grill and grilling. Or agrichar, charcoal that you can add to soil. Black carbon is the general term we use for some carbon or organic matter that came from fire. Oop. Soot is something else. Soot is, when you burn this, if you have, the smoke, when it condenses, that forms soot. And so that's different. So biochar is really charcoal produced from waste biomass. And so this would be a negative emission technology. The reason why it's negative emission. Okay, so usually when a plant takes carbon out of the atmosphere, right, CO2 from the atmosphere, and then when that plant dies, you have decomposition and it goes back to the atmosphere. So a plant is net neutral in terms of atmosphere carbon. But if we take that biomass and instead of letting it decompose and go back to the atmosphere, we make charcoal, that charcoal decomposes very slowly. So, if something dies in Florida, it decomposes in just a couple of years, whereas charcoal will stay for hundreds, thousands of years, maybe. So that's why it's sequestering carbon and why it's net negative. But there's more that biochar we've discovered can do. It actually improves the soil for agriculture. So increases soil fertility. And we think that, someone who produces biochar or uses biochar might be able to get paid, right? There's a carbon market, which is right now in California has a carbon market. Europe has a carbon market where, carbon is for, carbon that you prevent from going to the atmosphere is worth right now about $30 a ton on these markets. So it would help rural economies because it holds on to nutrients. It's kind of like absorbs and slowly releases nutrients. It would reduce the amount of fertilizer a farmer would have to use and the amount of fertilizer that runs off into our waterways. It also holds on to water, keeps moisture in the soil, and so less irrigation is needed. There's other research showing that it makes the soil, changes the microbes in the soil so that they're producing less nitrous oxide and methane. Those are also greenhouse gases. And those are just the agricultural uses. There's other uses possibly for, because it absorbs metals. So, if you have a contaminated soil, it could help with that. It could be used for filtration in water treatment. And so going back to agriculture, why does it improve soil fertility? So charcoal has a lot of nooks and crannies. It's very porous. So it provides a lot of moisture pockets and air pockets, and that is all good habitat for microbes. So, it stimulates the microbes, absorbs the nutrients and slowly releases them. If any of you study soil, you might have heard of cation exchange capacity. It basically does in soil what organic matter does in soil. Holds on to nutrients that plants need. Also, increasing the pH can be very good. You might have heard of liming the soil. Adding lime increases the pH. Biochar does the same thing and increases the clumping of soils. So here's one picture of an experiment that looks like corn. I'm not sure. I think it's corn. Or here's a few more pictures. So different crops react differently to biochar. And really research has to be done on all these different crops because there's different types of biochar you can make. Some might be better for this crop or that crop, or how much biochar is the best amount of biochar. So there's a lot of research going on in agriculture about biochar use. And that's not really my area, but I collaborate with people like that. Okay, so going back to the definition, biochar is solid material obtained by basically burning biomass in an oxygen-limited environment. And this is called pyrolysis. Okay, so if you just have some wood and you burn it in your fireplace, all you get is ash because there's plenty of oxygen. But if you keep out the oxygen in some way, then you don't get ash, you get charcoal. And I'm going to show you pictures of all different ways to make biochar, different pyrolyzers. The feedstock, that is the biomass you could use, could be almost anything. It could grasses, wood, manure. Agricultural waste is often like corn stalks and husks. In Florida, we have what's called sugarcane bagasse. That is, after you grow sugarcane and then you squeeze out all the sugar, and then you're left with a whole lot of biomass, and that white waste biomass is not being used right now. You could even use leftovers after you've treated waste, water treatment, basically human excrement, right? We have another big waste source in Florida. Any guess? Hurricane debris, yes. After we have a hurricane, up in the Panhandle, we had a big one, and South Florida, we have, you could use houses, but that often maybe has a lot of mixed stuff in it that might not be good for crops. But I'm doing, starting a research project with people. We're going to work up in the Panhandle and figure out how best to handle all this waste. Right now, it's being piled up and burned, which is terrible, right? Not only the carbon goes to the atmosphere, but all kinds of other contaminants. Okay, so one of the things I do is look at biochar properties. So I've already mentioned some of these. It's very refractory, meaning it doesn't degrade very fast. It's very porous. So this is a electron microscope view. It has a lot of pores of big sizes all the way down to nanometer sizes. It's amphiphilic, which really means that it has a lot of different chemical groups sticking out that can absorb all different kinds of chemicals. And I already mentioned that it's alkaline, so it has a high pH. But really, its properties vary with how it's made. So this is what's called the combustion continuum, going from, if you make it at a low temperature versus a high temperature. And as with a low temperature, you have, it's more acidic, contains more functional groups, but lower surface area, low ability to absorb. But when you get to higher and higher temperatures, you go through this from biochar to charcoal, soot to graphite. You get more aromaticity. I'll show you a picture of what that is. But less chemical groups, higher surface area. In other words, we can tune the production conditions to the use that we have for it. So, or to show you here's a chemical structure of low temperature biochar. You can see these are the aromatic groups for cyclic carbon, with a lot of functional groups sticking out with oxygen, which can react with a lot of things, versus at high temperature, this is what we call condensed aromatic carbon. So you can see that the carbon content is a lot higher, and for this one, the oxygen content is higher. Okay, so how do you make biochar? Well, the traditional approach is there's a few different ways. One is using a kiln. This is a structure that you're trying to keep out the oxygen. Or you can pile up biomass. You can sort of light a fire in the middle of it and then pile up biomass to the outside of it. Another primitive technique, which, when I say primitive, I mean simple, really. Things that can be done very inexpensively in a less developed country. This is actually a recent discovery that if you have a pit that's shaped like a cone, when you burn it, it makes a flame curtain, a curtain of flames, which keeps oxygen. The oxygen is hitting the stuff right on the top, but keeping the oxygen away from the stuff on the bottom. And so this is actually a picture from my backyard in Florida, a pit that I built. And you have to, you light the fire on the bottom. And then as soon as you start to see ash forming, you put more biomass on top, more on top, more on top. And so you're always burning from the top and you're pyrolyzing down below. However, you have to sit there tending it for 2 or 3 hours, but it's kind of a fun afternoon activity you can do with friends and drink beer or whatever. This is another what's called the Kon-Tiki flame curtain. So essentially, you're taking that same pit, that conical pit, but you're taking it above ground. Oh, I found the difficulty with this is that after you're done, you've got to dig the charcoal out of it and you're mixing in a lot of soil with it. So it gets very sandy. And then also, over time, if you wait a few months, we get a big rainstorm, your cone shape is destroyed. So this keeps your cone shape intact. I have to hit something. This is also in my backyard. I got a 50-gallon 50-gallon tank, that's most people are just sort of giving away. And you can see you're, again, burning in a way that you've got it contained. You're keeping out the oxygen. I love this. So you can see this, a curtain of flames. But again, you still have to keep feeding it. So you're burning from the top. But in a couple hours, I produced, a large amount of charcoal. Of course, then you want to crush it so that, you have more surface area before you add it to soil. Here's what's called a TLUD. This was the most popular method over the last couple decades, but has kind of been abandoned for the flame curtain approach. This is a new product on the line only for a few years. This is really what you would use for managing hurricane debris or maybe a large amount of biomass if you had it on a large farm. But there's also, more industrial mechanisms you can come up with using kind of a feed approach with a screw, what's called flash pyrolysis. If you have a really high temperature for a short time, you can also quickly make biochar. And I guess, it can get really big. And they're actually building a really big biomass plant in Central Florida, which is not yet online, but there's a lot of interest in it. There's about 30 commercial producers now in the United States that have really just started in the last couple of years. And the research on biochar has really increased. This is starting in 2010 with only about 150. We're talking about scientific papers each year, and now we're up to about 1,000 papers a year. And this is when I started, about 2009, with my biochar research. And I would really credit biochar to making my career, because as you can imagine, when you have the first papers in a field that grows, you get a lot of citations. And of course, that's academics like that. Okay, so my research centers on the questions of really how effective is biochar in mitigating climate change? In other words, how stable is that carbon? And what kind of charcoal made what way will be around for how long? And you really want to know an exact number, because if there's a carbon market and if people are going to be paid for the carbon they sequester, you have to be able to say, well, how much carbon did I sequester? And then also I look at different uses of charcoal of different types. But I do in my lab characterization, meaning, what's the chemistry and the surface structure. Again, how stable is it in the laboratory or out in the field? There's interactions with organic matter that actually lead to not just the stability of the charcoal, but when it absorbs natural organic matter, it holds on to natural soil carbon as well. Some of that biochar can move through the soil downward or laterally. Dissolved biochar, some of it leaches out. And I look at adsorption. So these are, and also as a geologist, sometimes I'm looking at ancient layers and reconstructing the history of fire on Earth, or maybe reconstructing the history of people, human-caused fire as well. So, I also take this into the past. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a look into my laboratory. So I have a very small pyrolyzer. This is a tube that I run nitrogen through. And this is so that I can really control the temperature, really control the gas, the conditions of pyrolysis. And then this is my product, and I might grind it into different sizes. When I do incubations, meaning I'll take some biochar and maybe add it to a sterile environment, add some nutrients, extract some soil microbes, a specific amount, and then incubate. And then, I can do it in these little tubes and measure how much CO2 is coming out. That CO2 is coming from microbes basically eating that charcoal. And this is what results might look like. This is, incubation over about a year. And you can see that this is oak biochar made at a lower temperature, decomposes the most, versus oak biochar made at 650 degrees, decomposes this amount over the year. And then doing some modeling of that data, projecting it into the future, coming up with a result, something like this, that, how much of that biochar carbon will be lost in 100 years? It can vary between 2 and 30% with, large amounts for low temperature biochar, but only 3 to 7% losses for this higher temperature biochar. Or you can convert those numbers into a half-life of something between 100 and 1,000 years for low temperature biochar, and tens to hundreds of thousands. So if your mitigation of climate change is your main objective, you want to make your biochar at a higher temperature. If you're more interested in increasing soil fertility, you might use this lower temperature biochar. But again, these are laboratory results. Field results differ. Your climate, depending on whether you're doing it in Florida, doing it in the desert. So we need a lot more work to refine these numbers. But the general idea, though, okay, so I didn't mention that when you make your biochar, when you pyrolyze, you are burning, so you are losing carbon. So, well, let's start with your biomass. If you just let your biomass sit around, it decomposes, and in a couple years, you've got, less than 10% of it. When you pyrolyze, you lose a bunch of that carbon, up to 50%. However, what's left is very stable. So after a couple years, you're in the green, right? You're sequestering carbon. And we also, part of my work has been to discover that we can use the hydrogen to carbon ratio, right? This is low temperature biochar. This is high temperature biochar with a lower hydrogen to carbon ratio. And there's a relationship between that hydrogen carbon ratio and the percent remaining after 100 years. And so this relationship can be used for people, once you make your biochar, you get it tested, to measure that, and then you can make your prediction for how much carbon you're going to sequester. And so this is, probably going to go into the regulations of how we're going to value biochar in the carbon markets. And I'll just show you one other quick slide. This is one just showing an adsorption experiment. Here's a grass biochar absorbing this chemical, catechol, which is a very simple, it's very, very simple chemical, but might be representative of a lot of different contaminants, organic contaminants And you have much more absorption of, of high temperature biochar absorbs this chemical a lot more than low temperature biochar, and grass was a better absorbent than oak. So again, these are the kind of work that I do in my laboratory. Oh, one more laboratory one. We can also modify the biochar. We can engineer the biochar. In this case, by absorbing iron minerals to the surface of the biochar, which then makes it even more absorbent. In this case, for arsenate, arsenic is a problem that can be a problem in groundwater, especially well, to some extent in Florida, but Bangladesh has a big problem with arsenic in their groundwater. And you can, use this engineered biochar to absorb arsenic. And another advantage is because the hematite used is magnetic, and so you can remove that arsenic with a magnet. So this could be used in water treatment plants. Okay, so for this absorption technology, you can imagine that it might be used in, maybe drinking water cleaning systems in less developed countries. You can add it into the bedding of livestock to absorb that waste, which makes a healthier environment for your livestock, as well as preventing those chemicals from, going out into our aquatic systems. It could be used perhaps in very local scenarios around, cleaning up storm runoff, in what are called bioswales. These are, some urban areas have been doing plantings along their street sides to prevent stormwater from getting into their local ecosystems, or even in a contaminated soil, like a Superfund site for making a barrier to the contaminants into the environment. Okay, so I think I covered, these are sort of specific research experiments that right now we're sort of taking those laboratory experiments and moving them, trying to do them in the field, which is a lot more difficult and gives really different results from you might see in the laboratory. And looking at enzymes, because there's a lot of different soil enzymes. We want to make sure that the biochar is not disrupting the ecosystem, soil ecosystem. And I guess I've mentioned most of these. So the big picture is that we can be using a lot of different waste biomasses. We can, pyrolyze it. Now, when you burn, you're making, it's exothermic. You're producing heat. That heat can be used for, heating a house, heating a greenhouse, maybe out in a farm scenario. The gases can be captured that is also a usable product for bioenergy, and the oils that come from them. And then there's a lot of different applications, from wastewater treatment, of course, sequestering carbon, and contaminant remediation. So looking at the big picture, this is a study that was done that estimates, they looked at all the amount of waste biomass we have around. And I think mostly they were looking at agricultural waste. They weren't even considering storm debris. But they estimated that biochar could offset about 12% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. So, it's not going to save the world by itself, right? It cannot completely tackle the whole climate change problem, but we don't really need one solution. We need, 10 or 20 solutions that can add up to the amount of emissions reductions we need. And so 12% is pretty good. And this is also showing, one of the other things we do with biomass is make electricity. That Gainesville has a biomass power plant. Well, this shows that we can actually, that biochar is a better thing to do with our waste biomass than make bioenergy, in terms of how how much carbon you're sequestering. Um, the looking at the economics of it a little bit better, the value of that carbon, I told you right now on the carbon market, it's about $30 a ton in California. Somewhere we're kind of right in the range of what the value of carbon needs to be for someone to have a economically viable, industry of making biochar. When you look at the, the cost of production and also the amount of fertilizer that you don't have to use, the cost of application, the increasing farm, yield. And so all those things are of value and they all have to be taken into account. But, I guess you could say we're right on the verge of this being economically viable, worldwide. Oh yeah. So what I was saying was, one way to look at climate change is that, this is what we need to do. This is what, business as usual. There's really we need a 9 billion tons of carbon offset each year. There is no single technology, but we divide this into what's called stabilization wedges. And, these are all $1 billion, 1 billion ton solutions. So biochar in combination with all the other things we need to do, is really the solution. But biochar comes with a lot of added benefits, as I've been talking about. One of the things is that, right now, I mentioned that people need charcoal in the developing world for cooking. And right now, that charcoal industry is very damaging. They're cutting down all, trees, valuable trees, trees that are endangered, trees that destroy the ecosystem. So getting rid of the charcoal industry would be an added benefit. Peat moss is right now currently mined for use in the growing seedlings. What's that called? When the seedling industry, growing seedlings, that nursery, the nursery industry, right? So peat, when you buy soil in the Lowe's or whatever, that's often filled with peat, and that is, we definitely should be leaving alone. That carbon is stored carbon, and when we mine it, we're releasing that carbon back to the atmosphere. So charcoal could be used in the nursery industry instead of peat. I mentioned holding on to nutrients so we don't get eutrophication, and also improving indoor health in the developing world where they use charcoal that is not very clean burning as it could be. Okay, so what's standing in the way of why isn't biochar already widespread globally? I mean, one is that we don't have these carbon markets right now everywhere. Florida does not have a carbon market. And so right now a producer in biochar would not necessarily be paid back for making that biochar. It's, new to agriculture. Farmers are not, don't really know how to use it. So we need a big education campaign about it. Right now there's a competition for biomass, right? Using, as we do in Gainesville right now, using it to generate electricity versus using it to make biochar. And of course, we're worried about if biochar does become very valuable, we don't want people to be cutting down forests to make the biochar. We want to make sure that we're using only waste biomass, only sustainable biomass. Okay, so in terms of my research, from my perspective, we need to be able to predict exactly the stability of that carbon. We need to understand how mobile it is in the environment. Is it, is it going to run off into our aquatic systems, and what will it do there? What kind of biochar is best used for what kind of applications, and how this can be upscaled into a sustainable industry that's going to, be a solution for climate change. Okay, and so just some acknowledgements to some of my collaborators at different universities around the country, some of the students that have worked with me, funding from NSF. Mostly, interestingly, you don't see Department of Agriculture because they have been against biochar for quite a while. This might be just starting to change. They would be the major funding source that I would like to target. But, because the USDA right now is really under the influence of big farming, right? And they, until they can see they can make money from biochar, they're not interested in funding biochar. So that's another sort of political barrier that needs to be changed. All right, thank you.
Okay, I've got the microphone and I'll pass it around for questions.
You mentioned it early on. Can you burn garbage? And it seems like there's problems with that, the toxic stuff, but you reduce the methane production that garbage dumps normally produce. And can that be scaled up so it makes a difference?
So, I mean, yes, the problem is if you have a lot of stuff mixed in with your garbage, right? I mean, it has to be organic. So it could be, you can make biochar from, paper and food waste. But, so yes. But if you have a lot of, metals that end up concentrating that biochar, you wouldn't want to be putting that on your soils. And so there's a issue there. So if you had clean garbage.
We have Phyllis on Zoom. Phyllis, if you'd like to unmute. Okay, we'll go to a question here in the Oak Room.
So, I'm trying to get straightened out in my mind.
Speak in the microphone.
I'm trying to get straightened out in my mind the steps it would take and the effectiveness, upsides and downsides of converting what's happening in Alachua County now, burning waste trees theoretically and waste yard materials to produce electricity versus and producing biochar. Could you review that?
Yeah.
The economics of that and the effectiveness of that.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, the biomass that's used in the biomass plant is, right, the trimmings from the lumber industry, right? When the lumber industry goes to their forest, they use the trunks. They don't use any of the limbs of the tree. So that's a good source of biomass. And they say that they only get it from within I think it's a 80-kilometer radius. So I'm in favor of the biomass plant. Don't get me wrong. However, if we had a biochar industry, I mean, right now we have plenty of waste biomass. So it's not it really isn't a competition, either or. Maybe at some time in the future, it will be a competition. And then we should be going with biochar instead of biomass for energy.
If we forget the industrial clippings and just use the stuff that the big trucks pick up in front of our house.
Yeah.
The clippings of our bushes, the fallen down branches, the trees that die, and all that stuff that we put out by the roadside.
Yeah, well, so you might know that the biomass plant won't take any of those pickups from the city because they say it's not clean enough,
Oh,
for their biomass plant.
so that's a good feeling only, not effective.
So it is not used for, they don't bring it over to the biomass plant. But that stuff would be fine for making biochar. If we had it.
Okay, Phyllis, we've got you unmuted now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor Zimmerman, for a very enlightening lecture. Um, Biochar is not something we read about in the New York Times. However, just recently, I read an article about the enormous waste of food products and how much of the garbage that goes into a landfill are actually wasted food products, which then produce methane. That's the source of methane from our landfill, or the primary source. Obviously, this needs somehow to be translated into biochar. It's not something that you mentioned, but
Yeah.
it's an enormous waste of organic material.
That's right. It's estimated that about 30% of food globally is wasted, whether it's wasted, on the farm during, during processing or in the home. So that is a big source. I mean, I'm not sure, the thing that we should be doing with that waste is composting. I'm not sure that, because it's going to be so rich in, there's a lot of salt in the food that we throw out, and you wouldn't want to have that salt go into the biochar and then go into the soil.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not sure that anyone's looked at composting versus biochar for that waste, but definitely we should be not landfilling it.
Yeah.
Producing it. Yeah.
Here's another issue from the New York Times. There was also a very lengthy article on carbon capture by the fossil fuel industry, and they say they're going to pump it back into the ground in order to force higher productivity from their oil wells. So I'm wondering, what is the net? This is not your field, I guess, but what is the net benefit or not of this carbon capture process where they're pumping it back into the ground? That
Yeah,
wasn't mentioned.
So there are pluses and minuses of doing that. I mean, one of the pluses is you're getting rid of some of that carbon. You're using a little bit less energy and chemicals, for fracking, if you're using that CO2. And so there is underground storage, but there's only, the places you can do that are limited to basically the same places that you drill for oil, because you need the same geological structure, kind of this upward hill structure to be able to trap a gas, which is what trapped the fossil fuel in the first place. So if that became a widespread solution, we'd have to be building pipelines for our carbon dioxide from all of our power plants to Texas and to South Dakota. So we don't want to start building more of those pipelines. And then the other thing is that we're not really sure that carbon is going to stay there. These geological formations can be a little bit leaky. You also can cause earthquakes, just like when you do fracking, when you pump that CO2 underground. And so, yeah, we don't want to rely on that as our ultimate solution.
Yeah.
Although the fossil fuel companies would like us to rely on them.
Oh, it's greenwashing. It's just another form of greenwashing. And the article also covered a big plant for carbon capture in Iceland. Well, so they're going to put the captured carbon into magma. I mean, Iceland is basically magma.
Phyllis,
And I wonder about the
we have
soil
time
chemistry
we
there.
have time. Phyllis, hold on, I'm
Okay.
gonna, thank you.
right.
That was two good questions, always
Okay.
good questions, but I want to give Paul a chance to ask
Thank you.
his, and then if Julianne will let me, I know that Barbara had a question too. Just one more. Okay, Paul, you're the last one.
It was hinted at the very beginning that somehow this sucked out of the atmosphere. I don't think it does that. But my other question is, what is the downside of adding this to the soil long term? There must be some downsides.
Okay, so your first comment was you don't think it's sucking carbon out of the atmosphere? But you're talking about biochar? Okay, so, no, the plants. Right, of course, right. Of course, the plants did the sucking of the carbon out of the atmosphere. We're just holding on to that biomass. Yes. Of course, yeah, the biochar is not sucking
not-
anything. No,
It was sort of hinted, I thought at the beginning, that it also sucked it out of the atmosphere. Okay.
right. Okay, so, and then the other thing, were you here at the beginning? I was talking about terra preta? Okay, so I mean, that would be indicating that long-term, it's healthy for the soil, right? Those charcoal that was added to the soil 1,000 years ago, that is now very prized, fertile, healthy soil. So not damaging to the soil, unless you've made that biochar in an unapproved way, right? With maybe a lot of metals or, something else, but if it's just charcoal,
We're good.
good.
Dr. Zimmerman. Thank you.
I'm willing to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zimmerman, for an excellent.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
There's some take off handouts at the back to pick up. Thank you very much. And we'll see you for the next climate conversation in summer term 1, I